Hello, my name is Jackie Samples, and with me is Ian Bigelow. We are here to give a Share-VDE webinar update to give some status reports on what we've been doing in the community in the last year. As I said, my name is Jackie Samples. I'm the head of Metadata and Discovery Strategy at Duke University Libraries, as well as the head of the Share-VDE Technical Transformation Council. With me is Ian Bigelow. He's the cataloging coordinator at the University of Alberta and the lead for the Share-VDE Work Identifier Working Group. Thanks for joining us. What we're going to talk about today is an overview of the Share-VDE and its history, along with the ongoing work of the Transformation Council and working groups. A particular focus will be on the development of BIBFRAME through the Share-VDE in relation to other projects, such as initiatives at the Library of Congress, LD4P, and the PCC. So what is the Share Virtual Discovery Environment anyway? That's a good question. It's a community-driven initiative to implement linked data by transitioning GLAM institutions' data to BIBFRAME. Share-VDE is also a virtual discovery platform with a 4-layered adaptation of the BIBFRAME data model. A platform was developed to provide a linked data discovery option to the member community. There are 6 main areas of focus for Share-VDE, and these are the enrichment of MARC data with URIs, conversion from MARC 21 to RDF using the BIBFRAME vocabulary and other additional ontologies as they are needed, data publication according to the BIBFRAME data model, and batch or automated data updating procedures, as well as batch and automated data dissemination to libraries. The progressive implementation of further use cases in the priority as defined by the user community is also one of the areas of focuses. So steered by the member library community, Share-VDE is a collaborative endeavor based on the requirements and perceptions of libraries, developed by Casalini Libri, who many of you probably already know, and at CULT as their technical partner, and with input and active participation from an international group of 22 research libraries. The participating institutions are growing. The membership is growing every day, and we're starting to work with the European institutions more closely as well. Our newest full member is the National Library of Norway, who joined us just last month or early in June. Work through the first 2 phases culminated in the creation of an experimental linked data discovery environment, as well as the return of collection data from participating institutions in MARC enriched with URIs, and then that same data set, those same data sets in BIBFRAME format. Prior to the creation of the Transformation Council, work was driven by member libraries through ongoing discussions and use case design meetings at the Library of Congress, at Share-VDE workshops, and LD4P workshops, and as well as communication at the European BIBFRAME Conference. As you saw in the last slide, 2019 began with the production phase of the project, which meant that a lot of discussion for a lot of libraries, a lot of interaction and consensus building. The 4 deliverables identified in the use case designing portion of phase 3 are listed here again. These are still in progress, which means, of course, that not all of the data sets have been processed and returned to each of the libraries yet, but that's an ongoing iterative thing, and we're about to launch a new set of deliverables to the member library community. So I just wanted to go over a little bit of the workflow for the processing. As you can see from the illustration, it's not a simple process to create the 4 identified deliverables for phase 3. In the work is a complex network of both human and computer processing, which includes matching headings to authority data, entity detection, and clustering, reconciliation, and the creation of a database of relationships between entities, such as persons, works, and publishers. Alongside that work, the data is enriched with URIs from several sources before being loaded into an RDF or BIBFRAME dataset in the cloud. That cloud data can be accessed by the Share-VDE portal, which is the discovery layer that rests on top of the linked data that was developed for the community. It may be easier for us to grasp the outcomes of the Share-VDE processing by looking at a data model or two. This data model was conceived early on, but was enhanced in February of this year to include the SuperWork concept. The SuperWork links to entities and other SuperWorks, allowing like resources to be clustered while providing granular enough data for the user to be able to choose the instances and items that they are looking for. This is the entity model that's currently in use, but of course, due to the changing nature of BIBFRAME and our interpretation of the conversion, the data model is continuing to evolve. The differences are that in this version, there's a new agent cluster and more granularity and extra clustering for publishers. There's also more explicit definition of the terms work and BIBFRAME work. The data model, as I mentioned, is continuing to evolve, and I realize that these images are quite small and likely not readable by you very closely, but I did want to make sure to say that, to let you know that we are continuing to work on the model to make it as fluid and appropriate as possible, and to ensure that it is keeping up with changing thoughts and changing standards, so it's not a static situation. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a very broad community or intersecting sets of library communities involved in the development and implementation of linked data in BIBFRAME. Share-VDE is now taking steps for further internationalization as this brings to the entire community even greater advantages of expertises and perspectives. So we have the sort of overlapping set of communities that include national libraries, communities like LD4P, organizations like the Canadian BIBFRAME Readiness Task Force, and others. So let's talk about a few of those communities in more depth. So the first is the Program for Cooperative Cataloguing, PCC, which in 2018 laid out in its strategic directions the idea that it's time to move beyond into the implementation phases for linked data and to extend our community in order to successfully navigate the changing landscape of library metadata. And that's what we're working toward in the Share-VDE community as well. We heard that call and we're responding to it. I think we sort of co-understood that is necessary. And I'm not going to read this quite long quote, but I do encourage you to take a look at the PCC document if you're interested and haven't seen it yet. As you all probably already know, BIBFRAME is an initiative that was started at the Library of Congress in 2011 and is based on linked data principles and concepts in order to move our data from record-focused to statement-focused data, which will make our rich bibliographic data more useful within the library community and beyond the library community. And it works with those linked data concepts like entities, and attributes, and relationships, and linked data technologies like URIs and RDF. And then BIBFRAME 2.0 came along, and it has different levels of abstraction. And so to strengthen our interaction with the community and to provide a level of leadership and coordination, the Share-VDE community, via the Transformation Council, will begin making formal proposals for updating BIBFRAME to the Library of Congress. We're going to interact with them a little bit more closely in the upcoming year and beyond that year, this year. Another community to mention is LD4, which for the past several years has been developing standards, creating end-to-end workflows, and extending the BIBFRAME ontology, as well as engaging the broader library community to make sure the work in this area is sustainable. Sustainability, of course, is quite important. LD4P community members also participate in initiatives to extend the BIBFRAME ontology standards and guidelines. So it's a broader group than just LD4 doing those activities. And currently, the linked data for production is in phase 2, which is called the Pathway to Implementation. LD4P phase 2 builds upon the foundational work of linked data for production, which in phase 1, and linked data for libraries labs to begin the implementation phase of the cataloging community's shift to linked data for the creation and manipulation of their metadata. So Share-VDE has a key role for the LD4P cohort, providing a consistent way for the provision of a highly reconciled pool of MARC production data converted to RDF for use in a shared PCC triple store, and for use in a newly created BIBFRAME editor called Sinopia. Sinopia is being built for the use of the LD4P member and cohort institutions, but we anticipate that it will become an open source tool after it has been more fully developed. The term Sinopia refers to the preliminary drawing for a fresco or mural, and is named for the reddish-brown pigment traditionally used to draw or transfer the preliminary drawing. So LD4P Sinopia is also a preliminary step, a sketch of what's possible on the way to being a full-fledged linked data production environment. But Sinopia is an environment where librarians can create metadata in a linked data environment without having to set up and maintain tools, to learn best practices related to linked data creation, to explore the idea of cooperative cataloging in a linked data environment, and importantly, to contribute feedback and expertise for the iterative development of tools for working in a linked data environment. So all those important aspects of engaging in the work and having development. So this is recently enough, almost a year ago, the National Library of Sweden became the first to implement, first national library, I should say, to fully transition to linked data. And so this example of a wider linked data community gives us some context for the international work. It helps us think about what to talk about in the European BIBFRAME workshop, which is happening in September this year. Gives us more places to engage. So after the Share-VDE workshop, which coincided with the ALA 2018 annual conference, the Share-VDE Transformation Council was formed to undertake the review of the conversion of MARC 21 metadata to BIBFRAME 2.0. Almost immediately, the need for subgroups was recognized, and charter and use cases were developed, but really only the work identifier working group was fully formed and operational before the Transformation Council recommendations were finalized and subsequently implemented. Of the 4 working groups listed here, really the UX UI was only envisioned just before ALA Midwinter 2019. So all of the groups are really quite new in terms of how long we've been working in this aspect of the transformation and conversion. So the Transformation Council underwent this conversion review process. We reviewed partner reports that were created from the universities of Yale, University of Chicago, University of Alberta, and Duke University to gauge the scope and commonalities of the issues that we independently and individually discovered. Then we analyzed the documentation, the conversion documentation that was provided by Casalini and Cult in combination with the LC conversion specifications. Then we analyzed data through the LC BIBFRAME comparison tool, which is quite useful. And finally, we also viewed both the MARC and the BIBFRAME RDF data side by side using a comparison tool that was created by Tim Thompson for the specific use. He is no longer on the Transformation Council, but we really are grateful for the work he did there. And so all in all, the conversion review process attempted to be as systematic as possible and as thorough as possible. But of course, our time frame really was tight, and we didn't allow for a comprehensive review of every MARC element by any means, and how it converted down into BIBFRAME. And the subgroup that was formed to undertake the review of MARC authorities and entity management didn't form in time to give real input. Members of that group are on the Transformation Council, so it's not as though we didn't have some engagement there, but it wasn't as thorough as we would have liked. So we began meeting full force in August of 2018, and we had initial recommendations back and finalized by the end of November. And then we continue to iterate those recommendations through January up until midwinter. So we had after we had that period of analysis and review from August to November of last year, the Transformation Council made 14 recommendations, and 4 of those were general recommendations and are listed here. And they're supportive of collaboration and openness in order to promote a shared community development environment. The remaining 10 more specific recommendations are less general and include topics such as preferred sources for URIs. They define the concept of a SuperWork and improved conversion of the series added title metadata. So the work of the PCC task groups mapping the CSR and BSR to BIBFRAME were very helpful in guiding our analysis of key elements through the conversion. And the Share-VDE community sees the value in the conceptual model of LRM and the use of RDA as a loose content standard rather than working on implementation of RDA RDF. This follows the PCC stance on RDA, but with so much in flux, the Transformation Council remains open-minded. And that is the end of my part of the presentation, and I'm going to hand things over to Ian, who's going to discuss the Transformation Council's working groups and more in-depth review of the conversion analysis.
Hey, thank you for that, Jackie. Apologies for the delay in sort of changing over. Yeah, so I'm going to pick up on things and talk, as Jackie mentioned, work through some of the past work over the past year or so, and an ongoing work of the various subgroups of the Transformation Council to get a sense of what we've been up to. And I'm going to start with the Work ID working group, which was formed earlier on and has gotten through, I suppose, a little bit more as a starting point. But I just wanted to thank the heads of the other groups too in advance for all the work that they're putting in. It's just been a really amazing effort. And just as that note that they're, we are talking for many people as well. So it'd be good to get other insight on an ongoing basis from other presentation options from the other working groups as well. Yeah, so the Work ID working group really sort of kicked off following a workshop at the LD4 sessions in Stanford University in May of 2018, where conversations really identified the need for a group to work on refining the creation of work identifiers. Well, for the Share virtual discovery environment, but also more generally in order to enable processes for the BIBFRAME community. So in the months following that meeting, members of the Work ID working group were identified from within stakeholder institutions, so those participating in the Share-VDE, but also based on relevant expertise, so those within the wider library community that sort of join as, I guess, consultants or external partners, or those that have expertise within different areas relevant to the discussions. And the initial charge was to review the Share work clustering outline and submit feedback on potential improvements or optimizations. So keeping in mind that this came out following initial project work for Share-VDE, where there was a process in place to get going with work clustering processes, so we had something to respond to work on improving. Also reviewing the use of primary resource identifiers, and I should probably say that when I refer to primary resource identifiers, I'm thinking of works, instances, items, or if you're more used to thinking in LRM terms, work expression, manifestation, item, and so forth. But in the Share-VDE data set, providing feedback as appropriate. Also engaging with the PCC to identify and develop best practices for use of these identifiers in BIBFRAME and in MARC. And the analysis sort of quickly identified a few key areas for further development. One was that other work URI vocabularies didn't really lend themselves well to practical application in Share-VDE, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. That the existing clustering algorithms needed to be refined somewhat and adjusted to take MARC practice into account and cover the identification of more works types and various work relationships. We also wanted to create work identifiers that would be useful within Share-VDE, but also for the wider library community. And we wanted to keep an open mind about the definition of what a work is in the context of Share-VDE, and to take sort of a practical approach to move forward. Oh. There we go. Okay, so I wanted to include this slide just in a sense as a piece to highlight that one of these things really is not like the other. So on the left-hand side, we have sort of a MARC or librarian view from the University of Alberta Blacklight instance. And on the right, we've got an equivalent set of elements or description for the same resource with BIBFRAME data in our own local GraphDB triple store that we've been using for doing some testing. And I wanted, aside from just showing the difference, it's worth highlighting in the sense that, many of the concepts that we're trying to work through have been in many ways theory for a very long time, but suddenly, much of it suddenly becomes very practical use cases that we need to have solutions to. Especially thinking about primary resource identifiers, we actually have to have a solid way to identify works and instances and build relationships between them, because otherwise things won't work properly. This is just an example of the current Share-VDE portal showing a number of instances aggregated by a work. And it's really fascinating to think about what we can, the way this looks now, how it can be used to adapt for other discovery use cases and so forth. But in order to facilitate this kind of thing, it's another example highlighting that first, we really need to have those identifiers to facilitate that aggregation process. You need to have something to point to within our data. You need to build the structures within the data. So the challenges for the Work ID working group really was a lot of work in a short period of time. This is an example of MARC data that was converted using the Library of Congress BIBFRAME converter tool, the XSLT. And we've got the work identifier, work ID highlighted here. And you can sort of ask yourself, what is the problem with the picture, or what is this example.org work? And it gives a placeholder within the data set to give it an identifier for the work. But if you think about sort of next steps, if for a given institution, thinking about Library of Congress or University of Alberta amongst themselves, if you needed to load an additional data set, add to your data, many of the things that we're used to doing currently with MARC data sets and various ILSs. But if you need to do ongoing work with that, then you'll get a lot of duplication as more and more work IDs are created every time you load something. Things get even more complex than when you have a shared environment with many institutions with records that outline descriptions for the same work and so on. And you don't want those all to have, you want them to have unique IDs that you can point to. And so this was the challenge that we really wanted to try to figure out, was to have a way to create something for that will work for libraries internationally. So we did look at existing vocabularies. One key one was the OCLC work ID. And there were some challenges with technical methods for inclusion in Share-VDE. Someone like purely technical in terms of the scale of enrichment and the processes for incorporating them, but also in terms of a number of different organizations having their own institutional access to OCLC, potentials for others not having access at all, and how to bring that data into the data set. Maybe something we could overcome going forward. There's also a matter of definition in terms of the OCLC's use of schema and their work identifiers and the creation of it. There's been, I think they've had a number of different presentations about the general approach, but it'd be helpful to have a very clear definition of precisely how the algorithm works in order to compare, to see if it matches how other communities are going to do that and so forth. And also at the time that OCLC works were still considered experimental. I know that's changed more recently. So this is also an area that I think there's a lot of potential for work going forward. It could be another step for enrichment for Share-VDE data. It'd also be really interesting to compare approaches and come to a library standard for the creation of primary resource identifiers through algorithmic processes. There's got to only be so many ways to chop up a MARC record so that in order to create these work identifiers, for instance. So it would be nice to have a common definition. We did also look at the Library of Congress work IDs. And I think to date, a lot of I'd like to hear more, hopefully at ALA, about other efforts, but I think to date, the processes at LC have involved the creation of work IDs based on LCCN and also using name title authorities. And there was a little bit that would be great. I mean, one aspect that sort of prevented use was I don't think they were quite ready for use for enrichment at a large scale, but also it doesn't cover all use cases. There's not a name title authority for every work, and LCCNs might not exist for all use cases as well, thinking about the international community involvement in Share-VDE. So that really strikes to back talking to the previous slide in terms of trying to think of an approach that will work for every scenario, thinking about the international community as well. We want to have a data set with work identifiers or primary resource identifiers that's open to the library community writ large. And that's something that with the cluster knowledge base that's being created by Share-VDE, that's certainly the intent. These are meant to be openly defined as well, down to how the MARC is getting chewed apart, and we should have some documentation about that sometime in the near future that would be released in the form of a white paper. And so we really what we want to achieve is being able to have these created for a given MARC record that goes through a conversion process, and potentially also for BIBFRAME. There's a sort of a second step to that still needs to be discussed about minting based on similar algorithmic processes to create new IDs when there isn't one currently existing. But defining works was obviously something that was on top of mind for the group as well. BIBFRAME defines a work as the highest level of abstraction. A work in BIBFRAME context reflects the conceptual essence of the cataloged resource, authors, languages, what it's about, and so on. And taking that when considering Ferber and LRM, there's been differences in definition over time, and that's been, I think, a subject of discussion for some years. But the Work ID working group really needed a practical solution in a short period of time to having this work with a concrete data model that would actually bring things together for our users. So we wanted to keep an open mind on how we worked through these things. And one of the big differences that came out of the work of the Work ID working group more recently was the creation of the SuperWork concept. And I guess the two main areas for justification for this that are outlined here is that while work to expression sort of relationships can currently be expressed in BIBFRAME, they're really work-to-work relationships. And determining the initial primary work or various hierarchical relationships between works can prove difficult with that structure. Now, it still may be somewhat problematic, but maybe a little bit easier if you're thinking about doing original description in BIBFRAME, where a cataloger could outline those relationships. But if you think especially about the automatic conversion from MARC to BIBFRAME, you need to have a way to define which one is which. So through conversion from MARC to BIBFRAME, or automatic work ID, potentially generation based on BIBFRAME elements, unless we can define a difference of fingerprint or cluster constellation of sorts between that work and SuperWork element, then those relationships, what you think about between work and expression with LRM, would be harder to capture through conversion through those automated processes. And with the scale of data conversion underway, it seemed like it would be, one, a really great potential to test this, to have a data set that really outlines those relationships, but also it would be potentially a really big missed opportunity if those relationships weren't captured. So in Share-VDE, the work is defined as being equivalent to the BIBFRAME work that, in terms of Library of Congress BIBFRAME, but no longer the highest level of abstraction. And identifiers for the Share-VDE work are created algorithmically based on unique constellations of elements for BIBFRAME works. And the types of SVDE works and definitions for which elements are used in the creation are outlined in a Work ID cluster mapping document or documentation, which I'll point at shortly. Similarly, the SuperWork is now the sort of the highest level of abstraction in Share-VDE. The new SuperWork class, which is a subclass for BIBFRAME work, is meant to aggregate or group functional or near equivalents of BIBFRAME work clusters. And similarly, identifiers for the Share-VDE SuperWork are created algorithmically. So working through the process analysis with the working group, we identified a number of different types of works and SuperWorks that can be extracted from MARC data. This is just a capture of a few different examples from the documentation. This will still be refined with time, but again, we hope to release some of this documentation in a white paper so people can get more eyes on it, and hopefully that will allow for more improvements. Some may also surmise that some have a higher degree of confidence in terms of how sure a given cluster will be of accuracy for creating new works and superworks. And this is something that's going to need continued adjustment with time. So the way the work and superwork are defined in the data or made to work within the data, I just wanted to give an example here. So some work types are identified as, some works are identified as a type superwork. Works have a designation -1 at the end of the identifier to indicate the difference between the two types. Has expression is used from superwork to work, and expression of is used from work to superwork to create those connections and relationships between them. This is an example of sort of a back-end process that was developed to sort of show in green sort of higher confidence level clusters and those that are maybe lower confidence in other colors, thinking about the orange or orange is pink here. And it's not to say that the ones that are lower confidence are wrong, it's just they're based on MARC fields that are less authoritative. So you think about, you know, for some using the 245 in combination with say a 1XX might be less degree of confidence than using a 240. Similarly, a 245 without any agents to help with that identification process would be even lower confidence still. So we have the MARC data create certain limitations on how the processes work, and that's perhaps worth noting. And we will want to think about other automated cleaning processes post-conversion. So once these clusters are created, sort of being able to merge and split them, aggregate ones together as appropriate, and so forth. And so there's work will be ongoing to try to work on processes for that. And then naturally, we'll need to have human intervention. So that's something we'll talk about with the CKB working group shortly, but to be able to have catalogers get in there and do some of this work to clean things up too will be very important, and to give them tools to do that. Now, a lot of this work, Jackie already showed this slide, but I wanted to put it in context as well. So this ultimately results in a new model for BIBFRAME data for use for the Share-VDE, and then because Share-VDE data is being used for the cohort for consistency and being used for testing for this PCC shared data pool, then a different model for a fairly large group of for those working on BIBFRAME implementation. And in many ways, this is a much closer approximation to the LRM, where you've got work, expression, manifestation, item. Now we've got superwork, work, instance, item. It's critical to note here that this was not done specifically to align with RDA or with LRM, but was developed from a apparent need in terms of the way the data was working, in terms of what we were seeing in the conversions and what we needed in order to display, aggregate things appropriately, and so forth. So in this way, there's some external validation of theory from LRM, but significant differences should be thought about as well. Okay. So talking briefly about the cluster knowledge base editor working group, changing gears a little bit. So this group was formed with a charge to review the cluster knowledge base interaction/editor document, so a document outlining a number of different use cases for interaction with the knowledge base of relationships and so forth within SVDE, and provide feedback, and also providing additional use cases identified as essential for effective knowledge base management. So if that's as clear as mud, in general, there's two pieces that they're looking at, and one is use cases for the creation of what we think of as a cataloging editor, so that people can interact with the data. The other piece of it is thinking about the cluster knowledge base itself and being able to maintain it appropriately. So you're thinking about URI persistence and so forth, as some of these different clusters, if there's the need to merge them or split them and so forth, what does that mean for persistence, and how is that maintained with time? These are really critical questions, and so this group is going to have a lot of work ahead. I'm looking forward to hearing more from them. And just as an example, because they're working on the development of that for Share-VDE currently, This is a snapshot just of the Library of Congress BibFrame editor. So this is one of the things that they're working on, is to create something similar that will work within the Share-VDE environment, so that we have a way to interact with the data, to create new data, and so forth. And similarly for context, pointing back to Sinopia, this is a screenshot from Sinopia that's currently being developed for LD4. And given that the Share-VDE data will be used for LD4P, there's much that needs to be worked out for the interaction between the two, between the LD4P cohort and Share-VDE, and how the data is used within Sinopia. But then there's a question about parallel development, whether it makes sense to have a separate editor for Share-VDE or in some way to incorporate Sinopia. But I think discussions about that will come in the coming days. There's also the Authority and Identifier Management Working Group. And so if you think about the work that they're doing, there's a list of URIs for external sources that Share-VDE is currently working with. And that group would be looking at which ones are important for use, but then also different processes for how they can be utilized for authority maintenance. And that really has parallel discussion points from looking at the use of those within our MARC data, because through Share-VDE we receive the MARC data back for core members with the URI's enrichment as well, but then also how that works in BibFrame. So what does authority control look like in a BibFrame environment? And one of the recommendations, I think, from the Transformation Council was looking at alignment with that, at least that it would be coordination, some level of coordination with LC and the LD4 folks to make sure that they're on the same page for their purposes. But then it's also fascinating to think about that in the international context, because LD4 does not equal Share-VDE. They're still separate groups, although there's a lot of overlap with LD4. And thinking about the Canadian context, for instance, how we get Canadian authorities into Share-VDE was something very interesting in the coming days. I think it's exciting. It was exciting to hear that National Library of Norway is joining us, and think about what lookups, what URI vocabularies will be important to them will be really interesting to see. And as get more of an international context, that will be a fascinating process to see evolve. And this is just I guess a very draft, but an example of how authority control could work in terms of processing through Share-VDE. And so that group will be really looking at trying to map out some of these processes and how it can work on an ongoing basis with our MARC data and BibFrame. And there's a connection between the two as things get converted, come back into our systems, and we get data flowing in different directions. Finally, there's the Discovery UX UI Working Group. And this is just a snapshot. The Discovery UX UI Working Group starts at sort of looking at the portal interface, improving the way it functions so that it's more usable, for instance, so that it improves with time. And this is just a snapshot or a screenshot of the current portal. And you'll note probably a few things that you might not be used to seeing in your Discovery displays. There's the navigation on the left. This is for searching by person. This is one for Marcus Aurelius. You've got links for ISNI, Wikidata, Library of Congress, and so forth on the left. You've got some context coming up from Wikipedia, links to other forms for the name coming from VF, bibliography information, and so on. And down below the screen, the link would link down to different works by Marcus Aurelius, so you can browse by the different works and go into further searching. And it's worth noting that in terms of the work of that group, that there's the current portal, which has the 1985 imprint and 2015 imprint data, so sample data currently. But the current portal will shortly have the full collections from SVDE members live in the portal. So it'll be very interesting to see what the relationships that surface and so on. But they're also working on a new skin or a new portal design based on user feedback. A UX group called Samhaing worked with those on the UX UI group to pull feedback from mainly staff, so those that have been working on the Share-VDE Transformation Council and various subgroups. But as much as possible, we tried to get feedback from member institutions. I think in some cases, even pooling a little bit of feedback from different students. So that work will continue to try to get more feedback, I presume. And I think that this new look is scheduled for the end of this year to sort of have another approach to the portal. And this is just sort of the one search box kind of interface, one way to access it that's been prototyped. Then you can sort of search by agent. So this example with William Shakespeare, and you've got some of the context coming up about him, pulling, I presume, from Wikipedia in this case. Then you can browse by original works by Shakespeare, original works about him, related people, related original works, and so forth. Similarly, going by title, you get a similar sort of context snapshot. You can look at library held publications of Hamlet in this case, related original works. Then look at the results that come back by institution and so on, and then link back to your local catalog. So for now, we have the current portal. Until the new version of the portal is finished later in the year, we have this with the sample data in it currently if you go there, but shortly it'll have the up-to-date collection data for participating institutions. This is open on the web, so you can go and experiment with it there. And it'll be fascinating to see for so many reasons, to test practice, to see relationships, and continue to work on improvement. But there is still a lot of work ahead. So areas for further analysis, we still need to work on the review of conversion specifications, especially as we see the data sort of live and see how people interact with it, see what's missing. Work on the analysis of primary resource clustering further, develop methods to clean up clusters further post-conversion, establish clear authority identifier profiles. I say profiles, I mean which sort of URI vocabularies given institutions might want to use or given communities might want to use. Create tools and techniques for data creation and maintenance while maintaining the integrity and permanence of identifiers, so something for the cluster knowledge base working group to work on. Establish workflows for use of the cluster knowledge base by the wider library community for maximum impact. Work on sharing experiences with PCC towards development of standards. Look at the application of workflows in concert with the LD4P cohort, and really in general, looking at a number of different things for the implementation of linked data in libraries and appropriate data flow, workflow issues. So thinking about work that's been done thus far, continuing to develop MARC to BIBFRAME conversion processes. Something that will need to be addressed is BIBFRAME to MARC, because many will still need to use MARC for a variety of use cases going forward. Thinking about the source of the original data creation. So where do our catalogers actually do their work? Do they do their work in Sinopia? Do they do their work in Share-VDE? And so on. And the list really goes on, but so does the work. And improvements come with iteration. That's been one of the fascinating things to see with this project is that, with each, as time progresses, with each sort of different pass at different things, it improves. But at the same time, we have something concrete to work with. We have data to work with and learn from. And we have a portal then to sort of test and see what discovery looks like and so forth. And just to highlight that further, for those that don't know me, I am a father of two fairly young kids. And you see this in the learning process for children. And it's kind of the similar comparisons can be made, which I think is really interesting. So you've got an idea for something, a rough outline, and you take an initial pass, and it's not perfect, but you get some color in there, you get a really rough outline, and it's a starting point. But then with time, things improve. You get better. You get a much clearer image. Things improve as time progresses, and you get another iteration of it until eventually you have a clearer picture. And that's really sort of the iterative process of development that we're working on to try to bring this project to implementation, to bring this to fruition, which I think we're getting very close with this phase of the project. Thank you. And thank you. We know that this is a pre-recorded session, so questions aren't really possible here, but we look forward to hearing more from you in other forums and hopefully in various conferences and gathering places. Thanks.